A U.S. District Court judge in Montana has vacated the trial of the ex-boyfriend of a missing 23-year-old mother. Jermain Charlo was last seen in 2018. Michael DeFrance faced charges unrelated to her disappearance, but Charlo's case has not been solved. She's part of the disturbing number of missing and murdered Indigenous people. According to the Department of Justice, studies indicate that the murder rate for Indigenous women is 10 times higher than the national average. Connie Walker has been following this case and several others and joins me now. She's an award-winning investigative journalist and host of the Stolen podcast, chronicling Charlo's story. Connie, welcome. Thank you for being here. First off, tell us more about Jermain. It's great to have you and to have some attention on this issue. So Jermain Charlo, this case is still unresolved, more than 3 years since she was last seen. What more can you tell us about her and about the peculiarities of this case?
Sure. Jermain Charlo was a 23-year-old mother from the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes in Montana, and she went missing 3 years ago, over 3 years ago, in June of 2018, after a night out in downtown Missoula, Montana. Jermain was last seen leaving a bar in downtown Missoula, captured on surveillance footage, walking down an alley away from the bar. She turned a corner, and that was the last confirmed sighting of Jermain Charlo. Since the day after Jermain was last seen, her family has been desperate for any information about her and had to become advocates for Jermain's case. They were immediately concerned when Jermain went missing, and they, right from the very beginning, tried to ring the alarm and get law enforcement involved in her case and try to really become advocates along with the grief that they were experiencing. Our 8-part podcast dives deep into the disappearance, the unsolved case of Jermain Charlo, and what we uncovered were really disturbing details about the amount of violence that Jermain faced throughout her life and how it's reflective of the epidemic of violence that so many Indigenous women and girls face in the United States and in Canada today. And what we also were able to uncover is some gaps in the police investigation, that it took a long time for her family to be able to report her missing. They faced barriers in even reporting her missing. And even after she was reported missing, it was many days and before police really started investigating her disappearance, and her family had to rely on a nonprofit organization to help search for Jermain in those early days. And when you look at a case like Gabby Pepito and the number of people who became involved in her case in those crucial early days, of her disappearance, and the difference that made in terms of helping to find Gabby and helping to engage law enforcement, I think that, my heart is just going out to Jermain Charlo and her family, because I'm sure they are left wondering what could have been if they had received the same kind of attention.
Those 48 hours, as you mentioned, are the most crucial. As you're saying, her family, Charlo's family, faced barriers to getting assistance from law enforcement. Can you tell us more about how law enforcement in the U.S. and Canada typically treat cases of missing and murdered Indigenous people, particularly women?
I've been reporting on this issue for several years, and I've talked to so many families who have been going through this, who have had a loved one go missing or been searching for their loved one and met with resistance from police. A lot of people say it's difficult to get police involved. I investigated a case of a young woman who went missing, and her mother reported her missing to police and was told, oh, she's probably just out partying, give it a couple of days. I think Jermain's family felt that they faced a similar kind of attitude at the beginning. As I mentioned, Jermain was, in a lot of ways really similar, I think, to Gabby, in that she was very active on social media, very engaged in her online life, and also really connected to her family. And the day after her family didn't hear from her, her grandmother, Vicky Morgeau, was immediately concerned. Her family faced barriers even trying to report her missing, and that, I think, is part of some of the jurisdictional issues that sometimes can impede these cases, often on reservations in the United States and dealing with Indigenous people, law enforcement. There's kind of a patchwork of jurisdictions depending on where you are. And so her family approached the tribal police, they approached the county police, and eventually she was reported missing in the town of Missoula, where she was last seen. But I think that the other thing that I think we were able to uncover is that, despite the fact that she was eventually reported missing, despite the fact that the police, knew some concerning things about her disappearance, including the fact that, she was last seen with an ex-boyfriend who they had had a violent history as a couple, and her cell phone ended up being traced near his property on the night that she went missing after he told police that he had dropped her off. It took weeks for them to do a search, and even months to do a really thorough search of his property for Jermain. And her family has just been left, with so many questions about Jermain's disappearance and what could have happened if, the media response had been greater, if the police response had been quicker. And unfortunately, they're just one of hundreds and thousands of Indigenous families across North America who are left with those same questions, wondering, especially with cases like Gabby, seeing the attention they get, why their families and their cases don't warrant the same attention.
Yeah, it's what you're saying about their cases being sort of dismissed, or they're just off partying, don't worry about it, with the fact that we know that the first 48 hours are the most essential, actually mirrors something that Daniel Robinson's father told me about his son's case. And when he went missing, that a law enforcement officer said, oh, he's just decided to be a monk, which doesn't track with anything about his personality. Given that the murder rate for Indigenous women is 10 times higher than the national average, Connie, why do you think cases of missing and murdered Indigenous people simply don't get more attention? Why is it that those first 48 hours aren't treated as critically important?
I mean, I think that there are many, many reasons why, this crisis of violence that so many Indigenous women and girls and men and boys face is not met with the same level of responses as others. And I think that, in some ways, this is a media story, and it's a story about, who we choose to highlight in media, whose cases we give attention to. Because you look at Gabby Pepito's case, for example, I think that the increased media attention, the fact that she went viral, the fact that so many people were interested in her case led to a greater police response. And unfortunately, I think that Indigenous people in our stories have been so, well, first of all, grossly underrepresented in media and often misrepresented. I think that, there has been a lot of really problematic coverage of this issue of missing and murdered Indigenous peoples. Historically, a lot of victim blaming in terms of the kinds of coverage. And I think that matches sometimes the police response. There are so many families who feel like their cases weren't taken seriously by law enforcement or by media. And I think that, we really need to think about what are we learning about Indigenous people in the media? But historically, our stories have been just underrepresented across all platforms.
Absolutely. And as you say, Connie, that the heartbreak for any of those parents, whether it's the Petito family or Charlot's family or any of the other families that are missing their loved ones, the heartbreak is just as devastating. Connie Walker, appreciate you coming on and helping to reshape the narrative.
Thank you for having me.